I'm with SIU School of Medicine, at the Center for Rural Health and Social Service Development. I am the program coordinator for the eastern side of the state with this particular group. And I do a lot of work in multiple counties on a lot of different topics. However, the thing that pulls me the most is usually addiction and recovery and mental health services, expansion of sober living homes. And with all of that comes working with this emerging adult population, which is basically what I call young adults, the ages 18 to 24, 25, and got pulled into this with my work judicially. I sit on the board for the Illinois Association of Problem Solving Courts, and I work in a lot of different venues with our probation departments, with our drug courts in many of our counties. And we have, the judicial system is full of this emerging adult or this young adult population, and it is a unique situation. We expect them to be adults once they turn 18, but you can't be an adult, you can't be a productive, responsible adult unless you have learned how to do that as a young person. And what that has done is pushed out a lot of research on this age group. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Some of the things that we're seeing that are affecting this young adult population and why they are struggling so much. And I know that much of this is not going to be new to you, but I'm hoping that we can put it in a context that makes you look at it perhaps a little bit differently. So we're going to hope that there we go. Okay. You guys have probably seen this quote from Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to just stop pulling people out of the river and we need to go upstream, find out why they're actually falling in. So if you can picture somebody who is standing at a river and they're fishing, and here comes somebody floating down the river that is really struggling, they're going to drown. And this fisherman jumps in, pulls them out of the river and puts them on the side of the bank and takes care of them and kind of gets them on their way. And all of a sudden, here comes another one, and then another one, and another one. And as a human being, yes, we want to help. We want to pull people out of the river. But really, if we really truly want to do what needs to be done, we need to find out why they're falling in the river in the first place. And that's a little bit about what we're going to do today. That's kind of how that looks. And I'm going to keep referring to that particular scenario throughout this presentation. This is just a visual of the ACE questionnaire. I know you guys are all saturated with the ACEs study, with the ACEs questionnaire, the ACEs score. We talk all about that because we talk trauma. But this whole issue of adverse childhood experiences, I think sometimes that we underestimate really, truly how much that affects what's going on, especially with our young adult population. I'm not going to hang around on this too much, but I'm going to reference this a little bit and remind you again why this study is so important. This study was done in the 90s, and the people that were actually, the people that were actually targeted in this study were people that normally we wouldn't think would have a problem. We wouldn't think that we would see any kind of childhood trauma. So these were adults that were white, middle upper class, college educated, good job, good health care, but we still found a direct link between childhood trauma and the ability for us to be able to predict adult chronic disease, whether they would be incarcerated, whether they would have employment challenges, all those same things that we're seeing with our adult population. So here are the things that the ACE study asks about, just running through them really quick. Neglect issues, whether you've had a loss of a parent, divorce falls in that, and we're going to talk a little more about that later. Anyone with depression, suicide, mentally ill, using drugs or alcohol, domestic violence, jail, prison time. Has somebody, spent a good part of your childhood putting you down? Did they put you in physical harm's way or unwanted sexual contact? Did you ever feel like you were loved or special? we kind of forget about those things. We talk about, oh, the ACE screening tool. This is a good tool. But really, we need to remember exactly what's on here, because this emerging adult population is the perfect example of what we're seeing when these things happen. Now, fast forward a little bit into the 2000s, and there was a group of researchers who said, you know, we really need to do another similar ACE study. This was done, it's called the Philadelphia ACE Project, where they really did target kids or adults that were in inner city. They were experiencing issues with racism and foster care and community violence and bullying, neighborhood safety. Are they living in a safe place? The focus was on inner city. And of course, we know they came up with the exact same results as they did with our population in the original ACE study, which were supposedly perfectly healthy, white, middle, upper class, have insurance, have a college education. So there's no difference. This is a human being issue. And I like to put this quote up here saying that, yes, we know that people with a higher ACE score have a lot of issues. There's going to be long-term challenges. We know that, but it's not the final predictor. If I can remind you of one thing, it is that this is a process that can be healed. Okay. When we put proper interventions in place, we can actually change the trajectory of somebody that has a really, really high ACE score. So if you're in a position where you work with this young adult population, or I recognize some of the names of the participant list that I saw here, if you happen to be working, say, in the elementary or the middle school or the high school aged kids, you have the opportunity to possibly shift that trajectory in several ways. So we're going to talk a little more about that. So yes, the ACE study has everything to do with this emerging adult population. And I'd like for it to just be sitting in the back of your head as we run through all of these pieces today. You're going to recognize some of the things that pop up on that ACE screening tool. I want to challenge you. I know that growing up, I'm 57 years old, and growing up, I always heard about gateway drugs. Back when I was young, the gateway drug that they talked about, if you can believe this, it was cigarettes, and then it was marijuana or alcohol. We talked about those basic things, and we still hear that discussion. And I'm not denying that folks that start using those things are maybe not, that they're definitely going to move up to something stronger. However, I want to challenge you to once again go back up the river and think about, why are these people actually falling in? And we know without a doubt that the actual gateway drug is actually trauma, childhood trauma in some way, shape, or form. And remember, trauma can be anything from parents divorced to my uncle sexually abused me for 10 years. We can have a huge wide array of traumas, but trauma is really the initial gateway drug. Keep that in your mind. Here are the topics that we're going to talk about as quickly as I can. I know I've only got till 11 o'clock, but these are issues that are very specific to our young adults, and we're going to kind of break down each one. And if you see on the right side of your screen, in quotes, I say, tell me your story. When we are working with these young people, when we're working with children who we know or suspect are living in some kind of a traumatic situation, it is okay and it's proper and it's right to look at them and say, tell me about what's going on. Tell me your story. I am amazed at the number of people who work with this young adult population that have never asked that question of their client, in whatever venue they're working in, but they've never asked that question. They might think in their mind, well, what's wrong with this person? Tell me your story. We find out so much by asking somebody, what's gone on? What's gone on in your life? Tell me, start from the beginning and tell it to me. You'd be amazed what you hear. And some of you probably are not amazed by what you hear, but every day my heart breaks at some of these stories that I hear. Now, I want to preface this by saying, yes, I work on a large scale throughout the state on a lot of projects on kind of in a higher up level, but I also work one-on-one with multiple people who are in this young adult population who are in recovery from addiction, or they are dealing with mental health issues, or they are dealing with domestic violence issues. And I never, ever fail to ask at some point, tell me your story, and allow them to share those pieces. And then kind of mentally, I'm checking off that ACE screening tool and giving myself an understanding of what we're really looking at. Don't hesitate to ask that question when you're working with folks. So let's start with brain development. We're just going to go back to the good old physical piece to start with. We'll get into all the social emotional stuff here in a minute, but let's go into the physical piece of brain development. An 18-year-old, which is again this emerging adult population, 18 to 24, 25, an 18-year-old is simply put physically not mature. And when we look at the brain specifically, we know that physical development overall continues on through about the mid-20s, sometimes even later than 20 if you've got, a young person that was a late bloomer. But that holds very true to the brain development also. And so we've got this prefrontal cortex that is still very immature. And that prefrontal cortex is what controls impulse, and it assesses risk. So a young person, a 16-year-old, let's say, a teenager, we know that they make really stupid decisions. They can make good decisions, but we know that on average, they tend to make some really stupid decisions, whether it's based on impulse or whether they're looking at the risk and they're not valuing that risk, doesn't matter. But we sort of mentally expect that when somebody turns 18 or 19, they graduate from high school or whatever they're doing, that all of a sudden they're an adult, and that part of their brain should be working and they should be making really good decisions. And I hear numerous people look at an 18 or 19-year-old that's made some really bad decisions and say, what in the world were you thinking? What is wrong with you? Well, what's wrong with them is that brain is still not developed, and they're still working off of that same 16-year-old mentality. But we're going to get even deeper into that just a little bit. But just remember that brain development doesn't really come to full fruition until mid to late 20s. Okay. We know that offending rates, so young people who are in the judicial system, those offending rates tend to peak at around age 20, and then they start to dribble off just a little bit in theory. And that's just as a whole. That's not every person individually, but that's as a whole. We look at that. Well, that's because the brain is truly starting to develop at that point. It's hitting that end development stage. And I want to challenge you to think about a scenario where we say we have a 20-year-old college student and we have a 20-year-old probation client. So our 20-year-old college student goes to a fraternity party and gets drunk, gets a DUI, ends up in jail, and is sitting next to this other 20-year-old that has a whole different life trajectory, perhaps dropped out of high school, perhaps not, but also got drunk, went to a party, got drunk, got a DUI, and they're both sitting in the jail cell together. Who do you think is going to get out first? It's probably going to be that college student. Who do you think is going to get off easier? It's probably going to be that college student, mostly because of our perception of the way that we look at them. But the reality is their brain development is very much the same. They're still lacking impulse control, and they are still lacking the ability to truly assess for risk. And so we need to make sure that we're treating those things the same. They just look different on the outside. Okay. They just look different on the outside. Let's go on. So also in this young adult time frame, this is the most unstable time of anybody's lifespan. If you think back, I don't know how many of you are in that age group now, but I am clearly not. So when I think back to that 18 to 25, sometimes I'm amazed that I'm still actually standing and alive. There were so many decisions to make during that time. We start to think about a permanent relationship. Love. Are we going to get married? Who am I going to marry? What is that going to look like? What kind of a job do I want? We ask our 13-year-olds these days, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? And they cannot answer that. Very few of them can. We look at our 18-year-olds and we expect them to be able to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. And I don't know about you, but on my part, when I was 18, I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I was starting to eliminate those things that I knew I wasn't good at. But I wasn't there yet. I certainly wasn't there yet. It took me a while to figure that out. I don't think I would have predicted that that I would be doing what I do today. It was probably not until my early 30s that I really began to hone in on what I wanted to do. So these young people are being asked, what do you want to do? What kind of education is that going to take? And what a terrifying question for a young person, let's say a 15 or a 16-year-old who is living in a horrendous home situation anyway, to be asked, what do you want to do? And have to think about putting all those pieces in place to do college applications, to fill out the FAFSA. I don't know about any of you, but I've got a young person that's going to be graduating from high school in my home, and we've been working on the FAFSA, which is all brand new and redone. And I have done this 3 times for my kids, my older sons, as well as once for myself, and I can't figure this one out. And I have a master's degree. So can you imagine a young person who has no support trying to figure out just how to fill out the FAFSA, let alone college applications, scholarship applications, or if they've dropped out of high school? It is very intimidating to go in for a GED. I took a young man in to register to start his GED, 27-year-old young man, very, very bright, but came up in a horrendous home situation, years worth of drug issues, just kind of a classic case of this emerging adult. And I took him to register for his GED. And I said, do you want me to go in with you? No, I'll be fine, he said. So why don't you let me just go in with you just to make sure you've got another set of eyes and ears on the conversation. Well, okay. And let me tell you, walking into that room was terrifying for me, let alone all the things that in those 2 hours that we were there, they put him through testing and he had to fill out multiple forms. Once we were all done, they sent him home with a book to study with that was probably this thick. I would say probably 3-4 inches thick, just to study from. How intimidating. And if you're a young adult who's had no support in the background, oh my goodness, how scary. And it's very easy to turn around and turn tail and run, because this is new. And they don't know what they want to do anyway. So we have to take it a day at a time. Identity, that is a huge issue right now. And I don't even need to go into detail. Our young people are trying to figure out who they are from a personal standpoint, from a sexual standpoint, just that general identity where they're struggling. And that's new. 20 years ago, we weren't dealing so much with that. So that's new on these young people's plates. They're feeling like they need to figure that out, and they're being given all these choices that maybe weren't there years and years ago. Socioeconomic differences at this age now become life-threatening. So the scenario for that is that if you have a young person who has maybe couch surfed throughout their high school career because parents were kind of in and out, maybe not really there, or it wasn't safe, or there was no home, that they were truly homeless and they're just sort of couch surfing on their friends' couches. That's a little more acceptable when you're in high school. But once you become an adult, once again, people turn 18 and we think, oh, you should have it together. You should be able to get a job, find a place to live, fill out the housing application, and just make this happen. Doesn't work that way. If these young people haven't been given the basic pieces of how to do those things, they're not suddenly going to figure it out at the age of 18. So now they're homeless. And now they're sleeping in the park, in the, the concrete building where the bathrooms are for the park, or they're sneaking into somebody's shed just so that they don't get soaking wet. So socioeconomic differences at this point become life-threatening. Now, this next sector, as we're thinking about this young adult population, we're going to go back and I'm going to spend a couple of slides here talking about family structure and dynamics. And you guys can throw rotten tomatoes at me, but after all the years of experience that I have witnessed and worked with, I am going to make a statement that some people might not like, and that is that our family structure and our family dynamics have gone way downhill for so many of our young people. And when the family starts to fall apart, that's where we start to see the trauma happening with our young people. And I know people think, oh, well, she's being a little bit pushy on that issue. But I don't think we can deny the statistics that I'm going to show you in these next two slides, and we're going to zip through them. I'm just kind of setting the stage for what so many of this young adult population have had to deal with and are still dealing with, and our current children are dealing with. So looking at the divorce rate, again, don't throw rotten tomatoes at me on this, but our divorce rate is 1 out of 2 marriages are going to fall apart. And when a marriage falls apart, that disrupts the entire stability of a family. Now, I know that there are those cases where a divorce needed to happen when there's abuse and so on and so forth. I'm not here to judge that. I'm just stating a fact that when the family falls apart, the children are the ones that typically suffer. For those people that go into a second or a third marriage, you can see that those rates of divorce go up even higher. And how many people do we know who have been in a second or a third or even a fourth marriage, or maybe by that fourth marriage or the fourth person, they decide they're not going to get married, we're just going to live with them. That's really tough on our kids. And we're starting to see some of the effects of that with our emerging adult population. The top reasons for divorce are infidelity, so having affairs, direct relationship to whether a marriage is going to stand, which in turn affects our kids. And our kids are pretty smart. When I talk to our young people in various venues, they can tell me right off the bat, oh yeah, mom is seeing, has seen 3 different guys in the amount of time that she's been married to dad. We see those issues, the kids are seeing it, and it is confusing. It is very confusing because I think innately we believe that our family is supposed to be our safe place. And it is where our family is supposed to be our safe place. And when we mess that up, or when people mess that up, it's very difficult on our children to make sense of it. Communication and addiction, those are givens. We know that when communication falls apart, our kids see that. It's not a bad thing for our kids to see us disagree, but they need to see us figure it out also. And communication is a key point to that. So many of these kids, 41,000 on any given night in the United States between the ages of 13 and 25 are homeless. That's an awful lot of young people that are homeless, that don't have a place to be. And if you remember last week how cold it was, people were scrambling to get into a warming center. Very, very scary stuff. I went outside for maybe 5 minutes and thought I was going to die. I can't even imagine somebody feeling like they have to sleep in that, find a safe place to sleep in that weather. It is traumatic on 1,000 levels there. 700,000 of our young people on any given day are considered not part of a family. And if the family is the basis for stability, and we've got this many of them that verbally say, I'm not part of a family, we're going to have trauma. Okay. High school dropout rate is actually at an all-time low in a lot of ways. Of course, we have pockets where it's much higher, but on average, it's about 5%, and that's pretty good. I would like it to be 0, but I know that that's maybe not possible. 1 out of 6 children don't have enough food, and we know that the effects of that are behavioral issues and illness. So ADHD, anxiety, aggression, those are all the things that we see with this emerging adult population. Still the same. It carries over. Teen pregnancy rates are down, but I brought that data up for one particular reason. That is an interesting statistic to look at because it can be looked at in so many ways. Any of us who have had a class in statistics know that statistics can be manipulated. And then this is a classic case of this. Yes, teen pregnancy rates are trending downward, but all we're really looking at with that statistic are the ones that are reported. We have an awful lot of young people that have an abortion or they do the morning after pill, and those pregnancies are not held into this same statistic. So we can look at this in a lot of different ways, but judging on what I hear on a daily basis from our young people, multiple pregnancies go untracked or undocumented. They simply are removed from the statistics because of that, because of an abortion or the medicine that is used for that on a private basis. So I think we need to be very careful about looking at that particular data. Drug use we know is highest in the late teens and the early 20s. The top ones there are marijuana, pain pills, and inhalants. They're easy to get a hold of, and we know that. And then they tend to move forward into the bigger things, although pain pills are a pretty big deal right now with our opioid epidemic. And the scary part, as most of you know, is that those pills, if they are, which they're going to be marketed on the black market, if they are made by a drug dealer and it's not an actual prescriptive medication, they are most likely to be laced in fentanyl, which adds to the effect and the risk for overdose. 1 out of 9 adults have a co-occurring mental illness and substance use disorder. Two separate things. Yes, they're under a similar heading, but they are treated differently. But only about 1 out of 10, maybe, receive appropriate treatment for both of those situations. That is a travesty. We've got to do better with that. We have got to do better. Keep on going here. 1 out of 5 kids have a serious mental illness. I have a school system within my territory here in Illinois that has, it's a very rural elementary school, and over 50% of the pre-K students, these are not even kindergarten, this is pre-K students, have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness. So I suspect that this number, this 1 out of 5, is probably lacking, mostly because we just parents haven't taken the time, or the situations are such that kids have not been formally diagnosed. The median onset for anxiety is 7 years old. If I'm not mistaken, that's about first grade. So these kids are picking up on what's going on at home, that whole thing, family structure and dynamics, what's going on. 50% of all mental illness actually begins by the age of 17. Now, anxiety is considered a kind of a lowercase piece of mental illness, or maybe a preliminary piece to it. High anxiety could be considered a mental illness, but by mental illness, when we're looking at this number of 50%, we're talking schizophrenia, bipolar, any of those things. And there have probably been signs of that early on with these kiddos. Average delay between onset of mental illness and treatment for mental illness is 11 years. So if all mental illness, roughly, not all, but 50% of all mental illness begins by the age of 14, and we take 11 years to wait and begin to treat that, that's a 25-year-old. And those are the young people we're seeing in our emerging adult population. So it's going untreated. And I'm going to move on just a little bit because there's more with that. Suicide is the second leading cause of death with our kids with ages 10 to 19. That is way too large. Where are these kids getting that? Why are they feeling like suicide is their only way out, their way to fix the problem? 1 out of 10 kids lives with an adult with SUD. That number is actually higher. We're looking at usually 1 out of 8. So if you think about, if you're an educator and you've got a classroom of 24 students, you can almost bank on the fact that at least 3 of them are living with a parent with a substance use disorder. This next piece, this next little line, no baby talk as infants. Let me explain that. You know, when we bring a new baby home, we hold them close. And as they make eye contact with them, we talk to them in a high-pitched voice. Oh my goodness, look how sweet you are. And we're holding them up close to us and talking. And we try to get them to smile and make eye contact and coo and gurgle. And you guys all know that wonderful stage, usually about 6 weeks, 7 weeks old, and they start to respond to us. That is basic, the very basic earliest learning pieces for those little people. Okay, so we know that young people, young adults who did not have an adult do that for them, that these people, these young adults or these kids, if you're looking at elementary, junior high, and high school age, that they have a decreased language ability, their cognitive abilities struggle, their social adeptness. That means that in a social situation, they're very awkward. They don't know how to act. Their responsiveness to people that are speaking to them or trying to teach them is lacking. And that's all been traced through a study. And it's interesting to note that it affects who we are as an adult also. Think of that emerging adult population. Their language skills are usually lacking. Their cognitive ability shows up as they don't know what they're doing. They struggled with school. They were awkward in school. They didn't have friends. They didn't know what to say or what to do, and they may have acted out. That it can all many times be traced to this small part. I'm going to use my young man that I was telling you about that I took in to do his GED. Grew up in a horrendous home, both parents doing drugs, running drugs, dealing drugs, the whole shebang. But he did have a mother that did pay attention to him as a small child, didn't do a great job of it as he grew up, but he did have some of those pieces. Now, fast forward when I took him in to get his GED, smart young man. He passed the 2 initial screening exams, having only missed like 1 or 2 questions. And so the GED instructor told me he's going to breeze through this. He'll probably be done in just a couple months. He really has a good basis. Well, there were some other parts to his life that fed into that. He had some coaches that stepped in and pulled him in to play basketball and kept on him about his grades up through junior high. It wasn't until he got into high school that things got really, really ugly. But he had people feeding into him. And then he lost that for a while and then comes back as a 27-year-old. And you can see as those things start to open up and blossom, the prospects that he has in front of him going forward. So let's go on. 54% of our teenagers, so 13 to 19, see no reason at all to plan for the future. They just don't think it's going to get any better. So why make any plans? This young adult population wants to see results from treatment in order to stay in it. In other words, we have to really work very hard early on, a lot of time intensive work with this young population for them to begin to see some results, because otherwise they're going to walk. They've not been taught to stick it out. They're going to walk and they're going to say, well, this is foolishness. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to do this. They usually have stronger words, but I'm not going to put those here on a webinar. All of the issues that we see with drug endangered children, which some of you have probably sat in on my webinars on that. And I'm going to elaborate on that just a little more. There's an intersection that we know that when parents or caregivers are using drugs, that there's an intersection with what we call familial human trafficking. And that is trafficking of a child that's happening within the family. So mom uses drugs. She needs money for drugs. She sees a young person, a cute young lady, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her daughter in her home, and realizes that she can traffic her in her home, sell her to we'll just say men, to make money for her drugs. And they use that whole guilt piece to get this, to make this child do this. Mom needs her medicine. And if you don't do this for me, then I don't get my medicine, and it's going to be a bad deal. Or we don't have groceries. I need you to go to work to do this. And so these children have a much higher risk of being trafficked within their family. And that's a whole nother webinar for a whole nother day. I address that more in my drug endangered children's webinars. But it's a very ugly piece. And I have people say, well, really, I've not really heard much about that. I just haven't heard a whole lot about that. Two points here that I want to make to that. When I do these trainings, I usually have a significant number of law enforcement in them. And I will ask, have you ever, law enforcement, have you ever been in a home that you suspected this was going on, but you saw no proof and you had nothing that you could, arrest that parent or that caregiver for? And almost without a doubt, most of them will raise their hand. That's because we really don't have laws on the books that directly address familial human trafficking. It's also much easier to hide because it's happening in the home. It's not like we're not abducting a child and selling them across state lines and sending them out with, a drug dealer that's going to put them in a house and make them do this all the time. Family trafficking is much quieter. Yes, it's happening. And when I ask my folks, especially my emerging adult population that is in recovery from substance use disorder, so they're living in a sober living house or they are in rehab, when I have asked this question of them, without a doubt, anywhere from 50 to 90% of these young people will tell me, yes, that happened to me. Yes, that happened to me. So please don't underestimate what's really going on. Family structure and dynamics affect every part of a young person's development, every part of their life. And there is no reason for us to assume that when a young person turns 18, that they're not going to take that with them and it's not going to affect their young adulthood, because it is. It just is. So we know that children that live with this chronic stress learn to self-protect, and they use defenses that incorporate really ridiculous thought processes. Well, if I can just get this job at McDonald's, I'll be able to buy a house next year. You might be able to, but do you even know how to fill out the paperwork? Do you even know what to do? Can you get to work on time? Their cognitive distortions are pretty strong. And I know that those of us who work in that realm see that every single day. And as a professional, we kind of have to bring them back down to square one. Let's start with the basics here. Okay. And it might be just how to fill out a job application. Living in chronic fear during childhood and adolescence and that's when you start to develop all these beliefs about, what do I think about love and who am I and school and jobs and all those things. You begin to think about that. When you're living in chronic fear, you don't get a chance to work through those pieces that other kids that don't live in chronic fear do. And it hits you on an emotional and a psychological level with these young people. So of course we see them as young adults really, really struggling. When the family unit is destroyed, when it is not healthy, that pain and that confusion for these young people is deeper, because we expect and we sort of innately think that our family is supposed to be that stability. I think we're born knowing that. I think it's just a part of who we are as a human being, going all the way back to when we first began. That family unit, that's your home base. And when it's not healthy, you're really going to struggle growing up. And that young person is who suffers the consequences of that. So I've made the case for one trusted adult relationship can change the trajectory of these young people's lives. We know that if the adults at home are not teaching, that child is not learning. Coping skills are learned. So if they're not learned, we can't expect them to have them at 18, 19, 20, 21. From a judicial perspective, when I work with probation officers and we talk about this, our judicial system is set up that we have a juvenile division, and then the minute you turn 18, you flip flop over into the adult division, and the expectations are much more stringent. It's very difficult for these young people. They really struggle for many years, shifting from the juvenile division to the adult division, because they haven't been given those tools. They haven't learned the coping skills. They haven't been given a good basis here. But we do know that one trusting adult relationship can change that. Not overnight. It takes a while, but it can change it. A lot of these kids have not had a healthy peer relationship. So let's look at what happens in your childhood. We want to have good childcare. When you've got kids in a substandard childcare situation, it's a bad deal. Healthy play groups, play dates, all the things that we do with our kids, preschool, library story hour, supervised playground time, getting into some early athletics if that seems to be their mojo, or art classes, or whatever works for them. Do we have parents that are feeding into that? And then as a teenager, it kind of shifts a little bit. Parents need to be thinking, are they making friends? Are the parents providing transportation? Or are these kids being told, well, if you want to play on that basketball team, you need to ride your bicycle 4 miles each way in the snow and the rain and whatever. Are they going to make it? Are they going to get there? What about, are these kids walking the streets? What kids do we see walking the streets at 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning? Are those healthy relationships? Well, we know they're not. Extracurricular involvement. Now, I spoke about my young man who had some teachers that pulled him into extracurricular involvement, and he thrived during that time. It was only when he shifted from junior high to high school that he shifted his peers around him. And part of that was because of where he lived and what was going on in his home. I'll give you a little more insight there. At that point, his mom basically left him and his brothers in an apartment for a week at a time while she went to live with the boyfriend and do drugs. And so they were on their own. And you can imagine how that happened. And it's just an example of what we see. And I think we can all think of kids that have been living in that type of a situation. But those healthy peer relationships play a big part in healthy development that develops a healthy emerging adult. Lack of discipline and boundaries. We see that every day in the school systems. Just go in and talk to any teacher, any school resource officer. Their eyes will get really big and go, every time. I love Mr. Rogers, and I put that quote in there. I think of discipline as the continual everyday process of helping a child learn self-discipline. And these kids many times did not have that. They didn't have parents or adults that were setting and enforcing healthy boundaries. And if you look at the picture down on the bottom, that's not a healthy enforcement. You know, beating a child obviously is not a healthy enforcement of boundaries or discipline or whatever. So there's healthy and there's unhealthy. Kids who don't have a healthy, appropriate number of chores and responsibilities don't learn how to do that as an adult. So if they never had to clean their room before, don't expect them to be clean when they're 19. And we throw into this whole mix social media, and drives me nuts when I am somewhere and I see a 6 or a 7-year-old with their own cell phone. And mom or dad says, oh, well, I just did that. That's a safety mechanism. So if they're at a friend's house and something funky happens, they can call me and I'll come get them. Well, I get that. I do. But there are so many other pieces on social media that can be a problem that our kids get into. And that's a whole nother webinar for another day. We know that. But if they have access to a cell phone, unless it is well locked down and all the parental controls are on there, those kids are going to get onto it. Somebody's going to show them how to get into it, and they're going to get into all kinds of things. We know that. I don't even need to harp on that. But younger and younger ages are getting into these social media issues, and our school resource officers are overwhelmed by the students that are in that mess, that are working with that. Chaos. And this is, I'm not going to go through each one of these things real specifically, but when I say DEC, you see the DEC up there. That means drug endangered children. Coming from my drug endangered children's trainings or my DEC trainings, these are issues, these are specific things that our DEC kids end up having to live with. Environmental chaos. Those two pictures are very real pictures of what a young person or a child has had to live in. That lower picture was is trash and nasty, wet, moldy clothes that were down in a basement. Just piles and piles and piles of this stuff, bugs and whatnot. And there was a child that was in that home off and on through a period of about a year, 2 years, and was living in this kind of mess. Lack of supervision, lack of necessities. When our young people, our children, don't have toilet paper at home, what happens? And how do those kids deal with that? They can't just go walking to the store to get it. So they're left with having to figure something out. Now, project that into our young adult population, our emerging adult population, and they have had to live in that fear of if I'm going to go to the bathroom and I'm going to poop, is there going to be toilet paper there? Am I going to be able to take a shower? Think of a high school student. Am I going to be able to take a shower and wash my hair? Because I haven't washed my hair for 3 days and mom didn't buy any shampoo or we have nothing at home. They're going to suffer. The kid's going to go to school and they're going to get teased, and that all ties into. So then we fast forward to our emerging adult population and we wonder why these kids show up and they look horrendous, or the clothes are torn up or dirty or whatever. It's because it's what they've learned to deal with. It's what they've learned to live with. They live with violence. I've already touched on the family human trafficking, family chaos, and I've just got a whole list here: divorce, arrest, multiple partners, mom and dad, or whoever the caregivers are. Multiple partners means lots of extra people in the home. And what are we teaching them at that younger age? And what are they going to take with them as emerging adults? Well, they're going to take this with them. They're going to think that that's okay. That's a normal way to live. We'll just shift partners every couple of months. And you can imagine all the pieces that come with that. Drugs, the use, the manufacturer, and the distribution all have their own pieces of chaos that add to what this child has had to live in. And if they've learned to live in chaos as children, it's not going to automatically change when they turn 18. Trauma. These are all the things you guys already know about trauma. Just we've already kind of spoken through them all the way through. Chronic trauma overwhelms the bodily systems. It rewires the brain. How do we help with that? What can we do on the outside looking in? And this is applicable to children. This is applicable to our emerging adults. But with our emerging adults, they've got a longer basis of trauma that you're going to have to work through. It's going to take more time. Making them feel safe, making sure that they understand you are a stable, reliable person that they can come to, because that might be their only bit of stability. Stability can also come in the form of a stable home, a stable foster home, or another situation that creates stability for them. It might be a group home. Everybody's a little bit different. Consistency, the same people. So I'll use this example. Some of my probation offices have a high turnover rate of probation officers. And that's really hard on these young people when each different person asks them, well, tell me your story. Tell me what's going on. Or I read your chart. So let's start from here and let's go. They're not going to trust you. They need consistency. They need the same person meeting with them. That goes for high school guidance counselors. That goes for teachers. Routine kind of falls along that same thing. They do better. This emerging adult population will do better if they have a routine, and that may be something that you're working with them on. You also have to remember that you've got to have some flexibility in finding what works for them. There's going to be trial and there's going to be error and they're going to fail. It's just the way it is. They didn't learn it early on. And so now you're trying to break through the traumatic pieces and teach that to them, and it's going to take time. And with that, we swing all the way back around again to those individual differences with each one of them. What's their story? Ask them what their story is. Get to know them. Get to and hear what they're saying. Remember that this can be, trauma can be healed. It can be, the whole trajectory can be redirected within the brain. And yes, the brain can rewire itself. And yes, the earlier the better. So it's much better to get to these kids when they're kids. But if you've got them as a young adult, you need to remind them of those things. We can get through this. We can do this, but make sure that the we stays the same as much as possible, that consistency. Here, I just throw this up here. These are therapies that we use typically within this age group, but it's used in all age groups. But I just want you to see that there are options out there. These are all through very professional, particularly certified counselors. And you can reach out to Nancy or myself. I'll throw my information in the end. I'll bring up a slide that you'll see that, and you can reach out to me and see if we can't help you find those things. This is something that I would like to see on everybody's wall that works with this emerging adult population. You didn't cause this trauma. It wasn't your fault. You were a child. You didn't do this. You can't control what happened to you as a child. That was out of your control because you were a child. You need help now to work through all this. You are now responsible for your choices moving forward. And that's probably the scariest thing for them to hear, because they didn't learn how to make good choices to begin with. So that's where the kind of the glitch comes in, and you got to work with that. You can learn to take care of yourself. You can do it. But again, we've got to have consistent adults that are showing them how to do that, showing them how to communicate their feelings, a safe place. And I will tell you, some of those feelings, when they do start to honestly communicate them with you, are very ugly. Be prepared for that and don't take it personally. They've got to get that out. They've got to deal with it on the face front piece of things and move forward and celebrate their accomplishments. Every time, celebrate the accomplishments. My young man that I've been using as an example, he faltered several times. He is in prison at this point for the next 6-7 months. He calls me usually once a week and says, "Hey, Mom, how's it going?" He's not my biological son, but in the position that we're in, I end up being mama. And the first thing he told me this past week was, I registered to get a job and I registered to go ahead and start back on my GED. And I told him, I said, that was excellent. I'm so proud of you for doing that. Next phone call, I want to hear that you've talked with the instructor, whatever, that kind of thing. Celebrate those accomplishments. This is not the accomplishment that I would have wanted for him. I would like to be celebrating him graduating with his GED right now, but that's not the way it worked. His life is a little bit different. So I'm celebrating that accomplishment. Remember that the real gateway drug is not the drugs. If that's what they're into, it's actually trauma for anybody. That early trauma is where we need to go up the river and see why they're falling in. And remember, lastly, that when we heal the child inside of them, that adult will show up. It is very possible that a responsible adult will show up. It just takes time. Gonna leave that up to you, Nancy.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I want to remind everybody, please do the evaluation that will pop up. The other thing is this will be posted, the video, on our website, and it'll probably be up by the end of the week or so. Depends on how time goes, and we will get your certificates out. If you have any questions, my email address is on all the materials out there. Liesel's is here. And I think that this is something for us really to think seriously about, go up the river. I love that analogy. So I want to thank everybody. And if you have any follow-up questions, be sure and get a hold of us. I encourage you to look at what's ahead. Jerry Moe, who does work nationally, is going to be talking about Through a Child's Eyes. And this fits a lot of what Liesel's already shared. And I encourage you to link in with that. You'll be in for an incredible experience, and that's February 15th. I want to thank you and say have a good day and a safe week. Thank you, Liesel.
You're welcome. Have a good day, ladies, guys, everybody out there.
Okay.